It had been just over 3 months since I moved into my dream home, a modest but well-kept place tucked at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in a suburban neighborhood that looked like it had been ripped straight out of a real estate brochure. Lush lawns, pristine driveways, children riding bikes, and that faintly artificial sense of community you only get in places with a homeowners association. I'd been warned about HOAs before I bought the house. Horror stories floated around online about power-hungry board members obsessed with lawn height and the shade of beige you were allowed to paint your garage door. But I figured, hey, how bad could it be? I mow my lawn, I keep my yard clean, I'm friendly enough. I assumed I'd be one of those invisible residents who never made waves. That optimism lasted exactly 9 days. That's when I first encountered her, Karen. And yes, her name was actually Karen, like the universe had personally decided to set me up for a cliché. She was in her late 50s, hair sprayed into a helmet-like bob that didn't move no matter the wind, a visor perpetually perched on her forehead, and a voice that could probably strip paint if she talked at full volume. She was also, unfortunately, the vice president of the HOA, a position she treated with the seriousness of a Supreme Court justice and the nosiness of a small-town gossip columnist. At first, her intrusions were minor, a friendly reminder that my mailbox post needed a fresh coat of white paint because it had yellowed in the sun. It hadn't. A thinly veiled complaint about how I left my trash bins visible for an hour too long after pickup. A suggestion that perhaps my grass was on the long side, even though I'd literally just mowed it the day before. Harmless, if irritating. I'd learned to nod, smile, and say, "Thanks for letting me know," while imagining pushing her clipboard into a chipper shredder. But then came the outlet incident. It started with little things I noticed when I went outside in the mornings. My outdoor outlet, one of those weatherproof covered ones near the side gate, would sometimes be warm to the touch, as if it had been used recently. Once or twice, I found the cover left open, which was odd because I rarely use that outlet myself. I brushed it off at first. Maybe I'd left it open without realizing. But then I started catching glimpses of activity at strange hours. I'm an early riser, and one Saturday around 6:15 a.m., I looked out the kitchen window and saw Karen, dressed in full tracksuit glory, standing by my outlet, plugging something in. She had an extension cord running back toward her property. Before I could even process it, she unplugged whatever it was and walked away like it was the most normal thing in the world to stroll onto someone else's property and siphon electricity. I didn't confront her right away. Part of me was in disbelief. Surely there was some misunderstanding. Maybe she thought it was a shared outlet. But over the next week, it happened again and again. Sometimes mid-morning, sometimes just after dusk, and once, bizarrely, at nearly 11 p.m., when I saw the faint glow of a headlamp bobbing in the darkness. She was using my electricity like it was part of the neighborhood perks, and she was doing it with the brazen confidence of someone who'd never been told no in her life. The first time I tried to hint at it, I casually mentioned to her that I'd noticed my power bill was a little higher than expected. She laughed, and said, "Oh, well, energy prices are crazy right now. Maybe you should unplug your appliances when you're not using them." It was delivered in that smug, sing-song tone that made me want to swallow my tongue just to keep from saying something regrettable. The sheer audacity was almost impressive. But things escalated when I noticed she wasn't just plugging in small gadgets. One morning, I caught her with a massive orange extension cord plugged into my outlet, snaking all the way back to her driveway where, lo and behold, it was connected to a full-blown electric pressure washer. She was cleaning her car on my dime. I walked outside, stood there in plain view, and she gave me a little wave like she was borrowing a cup of sugar. "Morning," she chirped, before turning back to blasting the grime off her SUV. I wanted to say something, but I also knew from talking to other neighbors that Karen had a way of twisting confrontations into HOA violations for the other party. She was the type who would file a formal complaint about hostile behavior if you so much as looked at her sideways. So I swallowed my irritation and decided I needed to gather more evidence. Over the next couple of weeks, I started keeping track of her visits. I even adjusted my schedule to catch her in the act. She seemed to favor early mornings before most neighbors were awake, though she'd occasionally pop over in the late evening under the cover of dusk. Always the same ritual: plug in, run the cord to her property, do whatever she needed, then unplug and leave without a word. No note, no offer to pay, nothing. My curiosity was piqued enough that one day I discreetly followed the cord's path into her yard from my side of the fence. It led to all sorts of things over time. Charging her phone, running a shop vac, plugging in string lights for a backyard gathering, even inflating a bouncy house for her grandkids. It was becoming less about the electricity and more about the principle. She felt entitled to my property in a way that made my blood simmer. And then, one particularly windy afternoon, while I was in my garage looking for a screwdriver, I overheard her on the phone with someone, probably another board member, complaining about certain neighbors not maintaining their homes properly. If we let standards slip, this whole street will go downhill, she said. Some people just don't understand how to be good community members. I nearly laughed out loud at the irony. That was the moment something shifted for me. I wasn't just going to stop her from using my outlet. I was going to make sure she thought twice before ever trying it again. And as fate would have it, my house had one quirky little feature I'd almost forgotten about until that day. The outside outlet Karen loved so much wasn't just any outlet. It was on the same old wiring circuit as my septic tank's aerator pump. A weird legacy setup from the previous owner who had done some, let's say, creative electrical work. Normally, this didn't matter because the outlet was rarely used. But if someone were to, say, plug in something high-powered while the aerator was running, the pump would cut off briefly. And if the pump was off long enough, well, let's just say it had some aromatic consequences. That's when the idea began to form. Not malicious exactly, but poetic. A natural consequence, courtesy of her own behavior. I started to think through how it could work, how to time it, and how to make sure I could watch the whole thing unfold. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized sometimes the universe hands you the perfect setup for a little petty justice, and all you have to do is plug it in. Once the seed of the idea took root, it grew faster than weeds after a rainstorm. And I couldn't help but start seeing Karen's brazen electricity theft not just as a nuisance, but as a sort of ongoing science experiment that I could influence. First, I needed to confirm beyond a shadow of a doubt exactly what she was doing during these mysterious plug-in sessions. My initial observations have been casual, me glancing through the blinds while sipping coffee, but now I needed hard evidence, something I could lean on if things got messy. I bought a cheap, but surprisingly decent motion-activated camera online, the kind meant for wildlife, but perfectly suited for catching human pests too, and mounted it discreetly near the outlet. Within a couple of days, I had hours of crystal-clear footage of Karen casually strolling onto my property, lifting the weatherproof cover without hesitation and plugging in various cords. Sometimes she had her little portable vacuum in tow. Sometimes it was her phone charger. But the big-ticket uses were the most outrageous. Her electric lawn edger, that pressure washer again, and once a large commercial-style popcorn machine she apparently rolled into her driveway for a neighborhood movie night. The gall was breathtaking. She never knocked, never asked, never even made eye contact with my security camera. Either she didn't see it, or she was so self-assured she didn't care. And here's where the real twist of fate came in. In reviewing the footage, I noticed something about her behavior. She always used my outlet in roughly the same time window on certain days, specifically Saturday mornings before 8 a.m. and Wednesday evenings around 7 p.m. This lined up eerily well with my septic tank's aerator cycle, which kicked into its most active phase every 48 hours in the early morning and early evening. My house's previous owner, a retired electrician/inventor with what I can only assume was a chaotic sense of humor, had somehow wired that exterior outlet and the aerator pump to the same breaker. Normally, it wasn't a big deal. The aerator only drew a small load, and I rarely plug anything in out there. But if the aerator lost power while in the middle of its cycle, it would essentially hiccup, creating a small backlog of waste processing in the tank. 1 or 2 interruptions wouldn't matter, but several interruptions, especially during high-usage times in the neighborhood sewer lines, that could result in a less than pleasant backdraft in the system, usually manifesting as foul-smelling, slightly swampy water pooling in the lowest lying part of the connected property's drainage system. And guess whose property sat just slightly downhill from mine? That's right, Karen's backyard. Of course, I wasn't about to do anything truly damaging. I wasn't a monster. But I did think there was something karmically perfect about letting the laws of physics and septic engineering do their thing, with just a little nudge from me. So I began planning. Step 1. Make sure I could predict her next outlet raid with precision. I kept logging her appearances, cross-referencing them with the septic aerator schedule until I had a near-perfect pattern. Step 2. Ensure I was home and ready during one of those overlap windows. Step 3. Make the setup as enticing as possible for her. On the appointed Wednesday evening, I left the outlet cover slightly ajar, just enough to make it look like I'd been using it and forgot to close it. I also ran a short cord from into the side yard, plugged into nothing, just to give the appearance that it was in use, which I knew from watching her behavior would trigger her scavenger instinct. She liked feeling like she was borrowing rather than stealing outright. It gave her an excuse in case she got caught. I was in my garage, tinkering with tools, when I heard the telltale sound of the gate latch clicking. My camera caught her on the approach, looking around briefly before heading straight for the outlet. She unplugged my dummy cord without hesitation and replaced it with her own. This time, a long black extension cord that I later saw led to a giant inflatable archway she'd set up at her front yard for some HOA-sponsored block party. The aerator was already humming in its cycle, and as soon as her machine drew power, I heard the faintest click from the breaker inside the garage as the circuit hiccuped. She, of course, noticed nothing. She just smiled to herself, gave the cord a satisfied tug, and walked off to admire her fully powered archway. I let the aerator stay interrupted for about 20 minutes, long enough for the tank's processing to stall, but not so long as to cause any serious or irreversible issues. Then I flipped the breaker back on from inside the garage. The aerator resumed, but the damage, so to speak, was already brewing, literally. Septic systems are slow, quiet things. Their revenge is patient. I knew it wouldn't be immediate, but the next morning there'd be signs. Sure enough, when I took my dog out at dawn, I caught sight of Karen inspecting a suspiciously damp patch of grass along her backyard fence line, right where her property sloped downward toward the shared drainage ditch. She was frowning, poking at the ground with a stick, and sniffing the air like she couldn't quite place the smell. I almost felt bad. Almost. But here's the thing. I wasn't going to stop at just one lesson. No, if I learned anything from HOA politics, it was that repetition made the message sink in. I ran the same setup again that Saturday morning, except this time she plugged in her leaf blower. The aerator hiccuped. The next day, her damp patch had spread into a faintly odorous, squelchy zone about the size of a kiddie pool. By the third week of my coincidences, Karen had stopped hosting her early morning plug-in sessions entirely. I think she was starting to suspect something, though I'm fairly certain she didn't grasp the full connection. What sealed the deal, though, was catching her on camera one evening, standing near the outlet, staring at it like it had personally betrayed her. She didn't plug in. She just turned and walked away. Mission accomplished, right? Well, almost. Because as much as I enjoyed the poetic justice, I also knew there was a part of me that wanted the truth to come out, wanted her to know, in no uncertain terms, that her arrogance had cost her. But that would be tricky. If I revealed the septic connection, she could spin it into some wild accusation of tampering. So instead, I decided to set the stage for her to put two and two together herself. I printed out a few stills from my camera footage, her plugging in her cords, her pressure washing her car, and left them anonymously in her HOA mailbox with a note, friendly reminder, unauthorized use of another resident's property can have unexpected side effects. No signature, no direct accusation, just enough ambiguity to make her paranoid. And oh, did it work. For the next week, she avoided me completely. She didn't so much as glance in my direction during the HOA's monthly meeting, where, I noticed with some satisfaction, she was unusually quiet. She didn't bring up lawn height or mailbox paint once. The footage, the timing, the mysterious lawn swamp. It was all swirling around in her head now, and I didn't need to say a word. Still, I kept my camera in place and my outlet closed, just in case temptation struck again. But deep down, I knew the final act was coming. Not from me, but from her reaction. And sure enough, It came in the form of an HOA-wide email blast the following Monday. Subject line, "Reminder, respect your neighbor's boundaries." The message inside was all about maintaining trust within the community and ensuring that all residents refrain from using another's property without consent. It was clearly directed at someone, but without names. The fact that she sent it herself told me everything I needed to know. She'd been humbled, however reluctantly. Of course, there was still one more little twist of irony to come, and I didn't have to lift a finger to make it happen. That's the thing about petty revenge. You set it up right, and it keeps paying dividends without any extra effort. It was about 2 weeks after the mysterious swampy patch in Karen's backyard first appeared that the final act of this whole saga truly unfolded, and I swear it was like the universe decided to gift wrap the ending for me. By this point, she had stopped using my outlet entirely, hadn't so much as brushed against my property line, and her overly perky "good morning" greetings had been replaced with a sort of brittle, tight-lipped smile whenever our paths crossed. The HOA meeting after her passive-aggressive email was almost eerily civil. She sat there, flipping through her agenda without interrupting anyone, which made the rest of the board visibly relieved. I figured that was the end of it. My little campaign of septic-flavored karma had done its job. But the thing about septic systems is that they're like elephants. They don't forget. Remember those 3 interruptions I'd orchestrated during her plugins? Well, each one had slightly offset the aerator's rhythm, which meant the tank's internal bacteria colonies had been a little slower to recover than usual. Nothing catastrophic. Again, I wasn't trying to damage anything, but it created a perfect storm when we had a particularly heavy rainfall one Friday night. The combination of excess water and the tank's still recovering balance meant the drainage ditch behind our house, remember, the lowest point in the slope, was primed to overflow in a very distinctive way. Saturday morning, I was in my garage again, tinkering with a shelf bracket, when I heard the kind of scream that bypasses your ears and hits you directly in the spine. I stepped outside and followed the sound, and there was Karen, standing in her backyard in a pair of pink rubber gardening clogs, waving her arms and yelling into her phone. From where I stood, I could see the entire lower half of her yard was a shallow, shimmering lake, with bits of mulch and grass clippings floating in it. And the smell? Oh, the smell was unmistakable. It wasn't full-on sewage horror, but it had that pungent, marshy tang that told anyone within sniffing distance exactly where the water had been before it got there. I stayed on my side of the fence, feigning concern. "Everything okay over there?" I called, careful to keep my voice even. She glared at me like I just confessed to poisoning her begonias, but all she said was, "We've got a drainage issue. HOA will be hearing about this." I nodded sympathetically and even offered to lend her my shop vac, knowing full well it would be laughably inadequate for the scale of the problem. She declined, muttering something about calling a professional. Over the next couple of hours, I saw 2 different service trucks show up. One was a landscaper with a pump, and the other was a septic maintenance crew. The latter confirmed my suspicion. They were tracing the source of the overflow, probably finding that the blockage was more about timing and gravity than any one person's fault. Still, watching Karen hover nearby, arms crossed and lips pursed, was like watching a toddler try not to cry after dropping their ice cream cone. The best part? The HOA president came by during the cleanup, and from the snippets I overheard, he wasn't exactly sympathetic. Apparently, several neighbors had quietly complained about her borrowing habits in the past. Electricity, tools, even a neighbor's hose. This septic incident, while not directly tied to those habits in his mind, seemed to have softened his view on her untouchable status. There's something about being the source of a neighborhood-wide stink, literally or figuratively, that knocks a person down a peg or two. By Monday, word had spread. Not maliciously, nobody was gossiping outright, but in that subtle, knowing way where people's smiles linger just a little too long when they see someone in the street. Karen still attended the next HOA meeting, but she was markedly quieter, sticking to agenda items and avoiding the kind of unsolicited reminders she'd been famous for. And in a poetic twist, I couldn't have scripted better myself. One of the new business items that night was review of common courtesy policies regarding use of others' property, which the board unanimously voted to strengthen. The language was clear: unauthorized use of a neighbor's utilities, tools, or property without explicit permission will result in immediate fines. As vice president, Karen had to vote in favor of it. I didn't even have to look at her to know how much that stung. After the meeting, as people were milling around with their paper cups of coffee and store-bought cookies, she approached me. For the first time since I'd moved in, her tone was almost polite. "I wanted to apologize," she said, though she couldn't quite meet my eyes, for maybe overstepping before. I kept my face neutral, not letting the satisfaction show. "Water under the bridge," I said, letting the words hang there just long enough for the double meaning to sink in. She nodded stiffly and walked away. From that day forward, she kept a respectful distance. The outlet remained untouched. My power bill returned to normal, and I could mow my lawn without fearing an unsolicited critique. The damp patch in her yard eventually dried, though I did notice she invested in a small French drain system not long after. The camera stayed up for a while, more out of habit than necessity, but it never caught her in the act again. And every so often when I pass that outlet, I think about how close I came to just confronting her outright in the early days. If I had, she probably would have doubled down, painted me as the unreasonable neighbor, maybe even found some obscure HOA bylaw to make my life harder. But by letting her hoist herself with her own entitled petard and letting the septic system do the talking, I got a resolution that was both effective and deeply, deeply satisfying. Petty revenge isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it's about setting the smallest chain of events in motion and letting nature, physics, and a little human folly take care of the rest. And as far as I was concerned, the lesson was clear. If you're going to plug into someone else's outlet without asking, you'd better be absolutely sure you know what it's connected to.